All right, we are super excited to be here today with Julieanna Hever, the plant-based dietitian. Now, Julieanna has authored 4 books, including the brand new Plant-Based Nutrition Idiot's Guide, 2nd edition. She's authored 2 peer-reviewed journal articles on plant-based nutrition for healthcare professionals, and she is the nutrition columnist for Veg News magazine. She's also been the host of What Would Julieanna Do? She gave a TEDx talk. She co-starred on The Chef and the Dietitian, and she teaches in the eCornell Plant-Based Nutrition Certification Program. She recently appeared on The Dr. Oz Show, The Steve Harvey Show, Reluctantly Healthy, The Mary Osmond Show, The Jane Velez Mitchell Show, and E! News, and now the Mastering Diabetes Online Summit. Her newest adventures include acting as a co-founder and nutrition director for Just Sides and co-hosting Home Sweat Home on Facebook Watch. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Julieanna. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Cyrus and Robbie.
Absolutely. So maybe let's start here with a little bit about your background. Can you give us some insight into how you got involved in plant-based nutrition in the first place?
Plant-based nutrition has completely revolutionized everything I know about teaching nutrition. So I started about 23 years ago in the health and fitness industry doing personal training while I was in graduate school in nutrition. And I learned the basic stuff that we hear all the time, all of the myths that are perpetuated all over the place when it comes to nutrition. But I really knew, I just had this instinct, and I kind of started reading about what plant-based nutrition was and how it can be extraordinary compared to what I had been taught in graduate school. And once I started on myself, I used myself as a guinea pig, and it completely transformed my own health. And once I started doing this with my clients, it was unbelievable, the difference. So beforehand, I'd be able to do what was clinically relevant, what people would expect nutrition would have as an influence on people's health. For instance, people were able to maybe drop a few pounds or maybe to not have to increase their dosage of medications. But when I started using plant-based nutrition, people quite literally were getting off of medications, which, no, we didn't think that was possible. I was never taught that was possible. And people were actually reversing their diagnoses. And I mean, to this day now, 12 and a half years later, people are going to their doctors and their doctors are blown away by the difference in their lab work within a week, 2 weeks, a month. And it's just been extraordinary.
So give us a little insight into actually what changes you noticed on a plant-based diet, because you said it transformed your health. So what did you actually notice?
So I had lifelong struggles with gastrointestinal problems. Like I used to go to the doctor all the time. I was in the emergency room like for years, a couple decades. And, the doctors would give me fiber pills and powders and potions and say, I don't know what's wrong with you. And not once did any of these types of doctors ever ask me what I ate, which was shocking because if you think about it, the first and the most prevalent interaction with your GI tract and the world is the food that you eat. It is so crucial. And as soon as I switched to a plant-based diet, my whole system completely transformed, and I have not had problems like that ever since. And I also suffered with sinus infections. I would always, every year, and I even remember falling asleep in high school because I was taking Benadryl just to be able to breathe. And that completely cleared up with the plant-based diet as well. And acne, I struggled with acne from the age of 11 and I kept thinking it was going to go away, but I'm getting into my 30s and it was still there until I changed to a plant-based diet and then it disappeared. So those are some major things that I suffered with, but nothing, serious and imminent, but really things that bothered me and was a struggle for many, many years.
Yeah, and those are a big deal. I mean, I had allergy issues as well and acne issues, so it is impactful. Now, we all hear a lot about the Mediterranean diet. Everybody's talking about that, and you wrote a book dispelling the myths around that topic called the Vegetarian Diet. So can you talk a little bit about that book and what you cover in there?
Yes, I know it's a hard word to say, but it's it's a combination of vegetarian and Mediterranean. So really, I was, always you hear, and I heard this in grad school, oh, the Mediterranean diet is the gold standard in the research. It's the best diet out there. And, I always read that and I saw that, and every year US News would vote it #1 top diet. Still to this day, it still happens. But I kept looking at this and thinking, wait a second, if you look at the studies, it doesn't even make sense. Because if you go back and look at Dean Ornish and Caldwell Esselstyn and people actually reversing cardiovascular disease. And then if you look at type 2 diabetes and you look at what Dr. Barnard has done with reversing the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, something was like, well, how come we're not giving credit to something that's that extraordinary? Instead of kind of reducing cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular events by 30%, like what they've seen in like Leon and Predimed, which was like, it was a benefit. It was definitely helpful, but it was nothing like what we saw in the data for plant-based diets. So I decided I'm going to dive in and try to figure out what's at the bottom of this. Why are we not giving credit to plant-based nutrition like it deserves? And what I've noticed, so I noticed a few things. First of all, is that the most common thinking about a Mediterranean diet is, oh, there's these superfoods. If you drink a glass of red wine every night, or if you, duck your olive oil all over everything, or if you have fish, then you're going to live long and avoid chronic disease. It's like these superfoods. And I don't believe in superfoods or villainous foods. I feel like there's, it's the overall diet. And that's the thing. I mean, I love a glass of wine here and there, but, you'd have to drink 1,000 bottles a day to get the benefits of the resveratrol. And you can do, a million different types of ways of getting all those phytonutrients from all these different types of plants. And so you don't need that. That's not, maybe you don't care about your blood pressure or whatever after you've had 1,000 bottles of wine, but at that point it doesn't matter. But in all seriousness, even there's other issues like the olive oil. It's not the olive oil that makes the Mediterranean diet. In fact, I think the benefits of the Mediterranean diet are in spite of the olive oil, not because of the olive oil. And we can go into that if you wanted to, but I go into that in the book. And likewise the fish. So we always say compared to what? Fish compared to a burger. Yeah, okay, maybe that's a little better. But if you put all those meats together and all the animal products combined, if you look at them and you really analyze them from a nutritional perspective, they're not much different. They all are going to promote chronic disease. They're all going to promote diabetes. They're all going to promote cardiovascular disease, period.
If wine and olive oil or fish are not the primary health elements, we'll call them, of a Mediterranean diet, what is? How do you explain the fact that they're always talked about, but yet they're actually the things that are, that like you're saying, the health benefits come in spite of these foods? Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
I would love to, and I'd also love to share some slides if you don't mind. All right, so these are the 5 elements that I consider to be at the root of not just the health benefits we see in the Mediterranean diet, but as we see in all of the regions of the world where the longest lived populations are, right? From right here nearby in Loma Linda, California, to right where you are, or nearby, Cyrus, in the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, and then Sardinia, Italy, and Okinawa, Japan. And these were, outlined in Dan Buettner's book, The Blue Zones. And really what it suggests is that it's the lifestyle that matters most. It's not one single thing. It's not just the olive oil. So one of them is the fact that the Mediterranean diet is actually a whole food plant-based diet. Shockingly to most people, when it was studied, it was only about 10% or less of calories that came from animal products in the traditional Mediterranean diet. It was used for celebrations and holidays and special treats. But really, most people were consuming vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And those happen to be, especially probably, it looks like the nuts and seeds, legumes, and vegetables that seem to have the most benefit. Synergy is the second one. If you think about how magnificent the human body is and how magnificent food is, it's just, there's thousands and thousands of different compounds, and it interacts completely differently once you hit the body. So it's pretty exciting to see what happens when you look at, for instance, iron. Iron is one nutrient. It's actually the most common nutritional deficiency in the world to this day. But we know that if you eat iron-rich foods like legumes or leafy greens, and you eat them together with vitamin C-rich foods like lemon juice or a vinegar, and you put them together, you're going to absorb the iron better. So there's all the synergy, and there's only just a little bit that we know. It's like the tip of the iceberg, because there's so much that goes on physiologically that we don't even account for. The third element is, like I said, overall lifestyle. People ate meals together. They were social. They were active. These men were out in the fields all day long, just working. And it wasn't like going and running a marathon and, training for a hardcore and then sitting for the rest of the day. These were just very active lifestyles. So now, we need to deal with stuff like stress management for a more modern day, and alcohol consumption and smoking and all those things. But it's really the overall lifestyle that contributes to the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, or just a healthy vegetarian diet. The next one is less is more. And if you look at the Okinawan diet, they use this idea called hara hachi bu. And I love this because the whole idea is to eat until you're only 80% full, and as opposed to getting stuffed. And what's interesting about that is because we kind of nowadays, a lot of people eat and just eat and eat. We're eating fast, so we're not really using mindfulness when it comes to eating. But what we know now is that in 2011, the number of overweight people in the world surpassed the number of people who were undernourished for the first time in history. So if we could start focusing on eating a little bit less, I think that is where part of the benefits come from. And finally, I like to use this kind of bad example of Italian. I'm going to try, sorry, but delizioso cucina, delicious food. I mean, people love their food to taste good. That's really important. And it tasted good. And plant-based diets taste good. And people always forget that. And people think that you're suffering, you're not eating anything delicious, but we all know how delicious a plant-based diet can be.
I just want to add that was terrific. Those are wonderful points. And honestly, in our coaching practice, we emphasize the importance of everybody enjoying their food so much. So I really love that last point. If you don't enjoy it, you're not going to do it long term.
Exactly.
We have seen a resurgence of those promoting a high-fat diet, and they specifically are villainizing nutritional greats like Ansel Keys. So we saw that presentation you gave at the Plantrition event this year. Can you go over the slides and some details of the history of how this came about?
Yes, there is so much confusion and contradiction in the media, in diet books, and on the internet on this thing called the lipid hypothesis. All right, so the most basic definition of the lipid hypothesis, because many people don't know what it is, it's that elevated blood plasma lipids leads to cardiovascular disease such as atherosclerosis. And while this can have a genetic cause in about 1 in 500, the lipid hypothesis also posits that certain diets can lead to elevated blood lipids. So the history of this connection dates back to 1913 with a Nitschkoff's observation of dietary cholesterol in rabbits. By merely feeding a rabbit some dietary cholesterol, atherosclerosis and heart disease was induced. Like they actually caused this process to happen by giving it cholesterol directly. And then Ansel Keys later pointed out that rabbits, unlike humans, rats, or dogs, have little ability to clear that cholesterol through their bile. He established that we were less sensitive to the impacts of dietary cholesterol, especially, and this is kind of important, is that when daily consumption exceeds 200 milligrams. When basically, if you think about how much, most standard American diet and most people are consuming, it's only a couple servings of animal products that's going to take it up to 200 milligrams or more. Ansel Keys began the Minnesota Business and Professional Men's Study in 1947. This is the next important point. He looked at 281 healthy men aged around 45 to 55. And by 15 years, 32 of them developed coronary disease, 17 suffered coronary deaths, and 16 developed changes consistent with coronary heart disease. But it was Ansel and his wife, Margaret Keys' trip to Naples in 1952 that resulted in his first connection of diet and coronary heart disease. So there was this meeting in 1951 with the FAO Committee on Food and Nutrition. And there was this Dr. Gino Bergami of University of Naples Medical School. And he basically looked at Dr. Keys and said, what? Coronary disease is no problem in Naples. I don't know what you're talking about over there. And so in order, Margaret and Ansel Keys were like, how is that possible? Because we're seeing so much of it in the United States. So they decided to load up their lab equipment and got in the car and they headed to Naples to check out what was going on. And while they were there, they measured about 356 Neapolitan workers. They confirmed that all of them indeed had very low cholesterol levels. However, the 100 wealthy members, interestingly, right, of the Rotary Club and Bolognese policemen assessed who had a diet closer to the US population. Anytime you look around cultures, the wealthier populations are going to have more access to these high cholesterol foods, the animal products. And those people had similarly high cholesterol levels as those seen in those Minnesotans. And then in 1953, Ansel Keys' now famous speech in Mount Sinai, which is often confused with the 7-country study. Here it is. Presented a first-look correlation of total deaths from all heart disease against calories as a percentage of fat for 6 countries from FAO data. These countries were chosen by Keys as representing fully comparable dietary data and vital statistics. So he felt strongly that it was important to move beyond these emerging associations to more rigorously controlled, he did a prospective cohort study.
Okay, this is fantastic. I love seeing this graph right here because what we're looking at is on the x-axis, we have fat calories as a percentage of total calories. And then on the y-axis, we have deaths per 1,000 people. And what this graph is showing is that as you increase the proportion of fat calories in your diet all the way from 0, or let's call it about, close to 10%, upwards of 40%, you see a noticeable and measurable, not even linear, but sort of a more parabolic increase in your risk for death. Right now, what we've shown, we've published a lot of results of studies that conclude a very similar thing, which is that as you increase the proportion of total protein in your diet, especially if that protein comes from animal sources, you see a very similar increase in your risk for all-cause mortality and premature death. But this is actually fascinating to me because I've never seen it presented in this manner here, where you can actually see that as a proportion of fat calories is increasing by percent, that you actually see the risk for all-cause mortality also going up.
And that's what happened. So in 1958, another key date, that's when he launched the investigation of what we now refer to as the 7-country study. He looked at thousands of people, directly assessed and monitored over decades. The first results were presented in 1970, but the follow-ups continued. And then in 2013, so just recently, 5 years ago or less, a 50-year assessment was presented on the cretins. And well, not really surprisingly, the daily meat consumption of the 7 countries participants, now they were in their 90s, had doubled. So they basically had changed their diet so dramatically, unfortunately. And their daily fruit and vegetable consumption had dropped by 60%. So returning to the timeline, it wasn't until 1961 that Keyes first offered the suggestion of specifically limiting saturated fat, which of course we see primarily in animal products, in Appendix 2 of the American Heart Association's report of the Central Committee and medical community. The notion that he rushed to demonize fat or saturated fat, you guys have probably heard that in media, he was always looking to find this. It's just not true. So in my look at over 50 publications that Keyes authored from the late 40s until the early 70s, it's clear that he looked at so many different associations. He looked at physical activity, vitamins, he was looking at carbohydrate, gender, race, smoking, obesity, lipid chain length, just all these different multi-variables. And he even looked at population migration studies, which show very similar things like what Dan Buettner was showing as well. And then it was early in April 1970 in a special edition of Circulation that coronary heart disease in 7 countries was reported, and that showed strong associations between dietary saturated fat, blood cholesterol, and risk of coronary heart disease. And then finally, in the lipid hypothesis timeline, in 1974, Brown and Goldstein elucidated the LDL receptor and LDL receptor-mediated endocytosis, offering even more evidence of the connection between saturated fat and heart disease. They actually received the 1986 Nobel Prize in Medicine for this work. So it's kind of interesting about familial hypercholesterolemia. If you look at that as an experimental model, it stems from the existence of something called homozygotes. So these people that have familial hypercholesterolemia, it's about 1 in 1 million. They inherit these 2 mutant LDL receptor genes, one from both parents. And this disease is really severe. They have 6 to 10-fold elevations in plasma LDL from birth. So they're like the young kids that have these high levels of LDL. And the early atherosclerosis in these homozygous FH children who do not have any other risk factors for heart disease like smoking, hypertension, diabetes, type A personality, all of those things, it just kind of provides formal genetic evidence that elevated LDL alone can produce atherosclerosis in humans. But if you look at that in contrast to all the children today that are obese, they eat excessive amounts of sugar and saturated fat. They're mostly sedentary. And we don't see them suffering from cardiovascular disease early in life like we do with these other homozygous FH children, because the elevation of LDL cholesterol in normal populations takes time. It takes time to develop the atherosclerotic. It would take extraordinary evidence. If you really think about all of this for all of these decades, it would take so much to unseat this lipid hypothesis. So it's something that, Keyes, who wasn't a vegan or vegetarian or on a plant-based diet, he asked this question his entire life. And, this is why there's a lot substantiated behind it.
Okay, so now here's the next question for you. As a registered dietitian, what do you see as the biggest challenge that other dietitians and physicians face in accepting and promoting a whole food plant-based diet within the medical community?
It's the idea that nutrition is an emergency. It's everything I learned in graduate school. I know what doctors learn. I've sat in on medical school nutrition classes. Everything is based on a deficiency paradigm. And we're so afraid of being deficient in a nutrient, you know, as if everyone's walking around now with scurvy and beriberi and pellagra. But instead, if you really look at what's happening, if you really look at all of the diabetes and the cardiovascular disease, and I mean, all of the most predominant chronic diseases, these are diseases of excess. We are overnourished. We are so concerned about getting our protein, healthcare professionals especially, that we've created this never-ending carrot on a stick. Like, we can't get to that point. Like, just try to make sure we're getting all of this nutrition, but we're having these repercussions that are unprecedented. We've never had in history before where we have more problems from overnutrition than we had from undernutrition. First time in history. So, you know, it's a barrier because if you're constantly looking for more and more and more, how do you accept the fact that maybe someone could be okay with eating less? How do you explain these populations? How do you explain the blue zones where less is more, where people aren't eating excessive amounts of food? They're not overweight. They're not dealing with the same diseases that we have now with all of this excess. So I think healthcare professionals are very concerned about that. And that's the question that comes up every time I go anywhere. Anytime I speak to anyone, it's, well, where do you get your this nutrient and where do you get that nutrient? But maybe, you know, the only way we've ever extended health span and longevity in all organisms ever studied, from yeast to primates, is by dietary restriction without malnutrition. And, you know, limiting essential amino acids, limiting total intake, limiting total calories, all of that together combined. That's the only way we've ever made organisms live longer and better. So maybe one of the reasons a plant-based diet is so successful is because of what it limits. And instead of being afraid of that, maybe we should embrace that. And I feel like I spent 11 years defending a plant-based diet. No, we can get plenty of iron. We can get plenty of calcium, like always defending it, when really that might be the primary benefit of eating whole plant foods.
That's really powerful point. Thank you for making that clear. I mean, Cyrus has done a lot of research on the calorie restriction part, and it's part of intermittent fasting, part of our program, so I'm glad you touched on that. Now, aside from healthcare professionals, what do you think is the #1 challenge that you see people face when it comes to making lifestyle change, and how can they overcome that challenge?
I think our own worst enemy is everyone around us and our society. I mean, like, we are built into the society where we are eating all day long, taking breaks to sleep and to work. You know, it's like food fits in everywhere. You can't get on an airplane without being fed. You know, you can't, you know, for an hour flight, you know, you can't, the gas station now have these huge stores full of junk food. There's just food everywhere. Every celebration, every, you know, social gathering is centered on food. You know, I have 2 children, and that's the worst of it, is seeing what happens in schools and at birthday parties and at just sleepovers. It's just this inundation of foods that we used to consider, in my generation, call me old, but I mean, in my generation, those foods were treat foods. You know, I didn't have junk food, not even once a week. It was holidays and special occasions. But now it's literally presented to us everywhere. And I think the problem is it's so socially acceptable to be consistently eating these junk foods that it's almost impossible to avoid it. So it takes a strong will, and it takes, you know, I mean, because it's weird. People think it's weird if you say no. If you say, no, I don't want to eat that, you know, or I'm going to have a salad. What's wrong with you? You know, and it always gets pointed out if you're the odd person out. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is just being able to have enough conviction and enough strength to be able to say, no, you know, I don't feel good when I do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to participate in that, and just being able to just say no. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And, you know, we have to be our own advocates, because no one else is going to help you. They're only going to help you. You know, everyone wants to feel better about them indulging. So they can't feel good about indulging if you're not indulging with them. It's not a party if you're not partying with them. So it just takes a strong will.
I think that's a huge point, actually, because, you know, not only is it not socially acceptable, but in certain circles, it can actually be socially unacceptable. And you can feel like an outcast for saying, you know, I don't eat meat, I don't eat turkey, I don't eat pork, I would like to eat some vegetables and fruits, heaven forbid. right? But what I do see now happening is that the tide is changing. And the proportion of the US population that's now becoming either vegetarian or vegan is growing. The number of people who are starting to think about making a transition to a plant-based diet is growing due to filmmakers and people watching Netflix and people like you going around the country and lecturing and telling people just the true benefits of adopting a plant-based diet. So do you also see that on your end with healthcare professionals and with people that now people are sort of like opening their mind to the idea that, oh, wait a minute, there is actually some scientific validity behind a vegetarian and or vegan approach?
100%. I've seen in the last decade, especially, a huge transformation, a huge awareness of the benefits. Definitely the database is expanding all the time. It's really exciting. But my one concern with that is what's also happening in the business world and how people are, of course, monetizing on this and providing, basically anything you could eat, I could eat vegan. So now there's all sorts of opportunities to eat unhealthy vegan foods. There's ice creams and, every kind of cheese and every kind of burger. There's so many different burgers. There's a burger boom now, that are emulating the animal products, and they're just not much different than the animal version of these foods, nutritionally speaking. So I'm concerned about that part. I want to make sure that's my message to people that are already eating a plant-based diet, is to stick to the whole plant foods so that they could avoid these chronic diseases that we're seeing. Like, I'm having a lot of clients coming to me now with the same people that are already on a vegan diet or have been on a vegan diet with the same exact health issues as I see with people that are eating the same standard American diet as they were before. So, but it's a wonderful, positive time right now. I think it's so exciting, especially with people like you, what you guys are doing. This is so important. And it's really, the options are endless. So just choose your options carefully and then you get all the best of all the worlds.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really important point about the unhealthy, healthy foods. Like, oh, these new vegan meats they're the healthier version, but no, they're really not. So before we go, can you tell us about your new book and why people should pick up a copy?
Thank you, Robbie. Gosh, I would love to. So I just published, literally just now, the second edition of the Plant-Based Nutrition Idiot's Guide. And this is a second version. The first one came out in 2011, and so much has happened. Like you just said, Cyrus, like so much has changed and evolved in the last decade, or I guess it hasn't been quite a decade yet, but in the last few years, there's just so much more research. So I was excited to bring on a co-author. I brought on Ray Cronice with me, and he's just adding so much to this book. And it's complete. We were supposed to just barely revamp it, but it is completely redone, and there's a lot of exciting stuff on metabolism and on health span and longevity, and just our message together is really synergistic, and I'm really excited about this new book.
That's great. And we actually interviewed Ray Cronice. So if you're watching this interview and you're interested in learning more about Ray, go ahead and watch his interview too, because he has he's one of the smartest people I've ever met before, and I'm not just saying that. He's got some brilliant nuggets of wisdom, and so you two make a very powerful co-author duo, and I really appreciate the time that you guys have invested into not only writing books, but also I know you're a very active speaker and you go all over the place. You're on television shows, you're giving talks at medical conferences. And I sincerely appreciate all the work that you're doing from the bottom of my heart. So keep it up.
Thank you. Likewise, both of you. Incredible. Thank you so much for including me in this.